In this particular question, we are asked to normalise the following table to third normal form. Now, this particular format for normalisation is not what you would expect to find in an A2 SSD paper. However, it does serve a purpose. It does provide a good discussion point and to discuss and really get into the nitty-gritty of how normalization works. And what I've done here is, you'll see in the notes section below this particular table, I have made some notes, I guess as pointers for myself. Normally in a CA paper you would have a case study and you would have a bit more context for the proposed database, and you would also have maybe a data capture form in which to base your normalization on. But I'll just go through the notes here, and this will help, I guess, formulate your understanding of where you're going with this normalization process. And the first thing I'll say is that this database stores students' results in each unit. So it stores details of each student's performance in individual units. Some things to note. I note that each unit is taught by one tutor, but that a tutor can teach more than one unit. So you'll see that tutor 3 teaches unit 2 and unit 5. I would also say that the grade is attained by a student in a particular unit. A unit can have more than one student enrolled on it, but each student can also study many units. I would also say that the tutor email is fully functionally dependent on the tutor ID, and that things like the room and the book also follow the particular unit as well, and are therefore fully functionally dependent upon the unit ID. So I'm going to normalize this particular example with under the assumption that everything is sort of fully rotates or pivots around the unit ID. So first normal form assumes that everything is in an unnormalized form, so that the data is all atomized, and based on what's presented to us in this table, the data is atomized. So in first normal form, which assumes that the database is in unnormalized form, that the attributes are atomized, then it says that you must remove repeating attributes. And the repeating attributes in this case, for me, are the student grades. For each unit, you will have multiple student grades. So for unit 1, for example, you see that you have the details for unit 1 stay the same. The date, that I guess it's not very clear what date represents, but it's either the date of the exam or the date the unit started, but it's probably the date of the exam. And you see that for unit 1, student 1 and student 4 in rows 1 and 3, they have 2 grades, a grade each, 4.7 and 4.3. So those are repeatable attributes for any one particular unit. And we see that for unit 1, the date stays the same, the tutor, the topic, the room, the book, and the tutor email all are fully functional dependent upon unit 1, based on the data that's shown in this particular table anyway. And the repeatable attributes, the attributes which can be different for the same unit, are student ID and grade. So the first thing we need to do then is we need to take those out to a new table. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to essentially just copy this here into this row, and I'm going to have a student table now, into which I'm going to take I'm going to take a copy of the field unit ID, because that maintains my link back to the unit table, and I'm going to take a copy of the or I'm going to take out the student ID and the grade into a new table, and those are the repeatable attributes, and they're repeating for any one particular unit ID. So I need to take a copy of the key field around which they repeat. So that's I'm happy now that that's satisfied first normal form. But before I finish that, I must assign the primary key again to these new tables that are formed. So the primary key in this table is quite straightforward. For any one record, the unit ID will be sufficient enough. If I enter a particular unit ID, that will be sufficient enough to return all the data, return one record essentially, which contains all the data that are specifically related to that particular unit ID. In this table, however, if I put in unit ID, I would expect to potentially have a number of students, a number of records returned, because you'll have a number of students who study that particular unit ID. Similarly, if I put in a particular student, a student can study many units, and therefore that would not be enough for me to have that as a single field attribute primary key. However, the combination of both unit ID and student ID, if I were to enter a particular unit ID and student ID, then that should be sufficient enough, based on the data I've seen in the table, to return one record. There's no indication that there would be multiple grades, if you like, for a particular student in one particular unit. So based on the data I can see, unit ID and student ID are primary keys. Now, unit ID is a foreign key in this field. It's a primary key in this table. It's a primary key in the unit table. So I'm satisfied now that as I exit first normal form, I have satisfied the conditions of first normal form. So second normal form is removing partial key dependencies, and partial key dependencies are key fields which are dependent upon a part of the primary key field. So straight away I know that the unit table is in second normal form, because it has a single field primary key field. However, student table it may not be in second normal form, because it may have a partial key dependencies. Now, this particular question is special in a sense, because we see here that we just have student ID. Now, we know that in any normal real world database, we would have a student table, and we would have other information stored about the student. Now, I'm going to break a rule here, and I'm going to create another table. I'm going to remove student ID to a new table, simply because you really shouldn't create a table just for a single field. But given the absence of any information about the student, and given the likelihood that there should be information about the student, I would be pulling this out in second normal form. So this table is going to become unit student. That would make more sense, and I'm going to create a new table called student, and into this table I'm just going to pull out student ID. Now, student ID in a normal real world database, you would have name, gender, date of birth, and so on. In that situation, I would be removing those fields and putting them into this table. So it's really I guess it's not a great question in that sense, in that it doesn't have any other information about the student. But I'm going to remove student anyway, student ID, to this new table. It becomes a primary key here, and it therefore becomes a foreign key in this table. And that is, again, before I exit this particular normal form, I'm assigning the primary key, and that's something you should do each time you are testing the conditions of that normal form. And to do that, you need to just think, well, if I entered let's say a piece of data for unit ID and student ID, for example, would that potentially return one record, or would it return multiple records? And if it's going to return multiple records in a search, then that is not sufficient enough for you, for those fields just to be the primary key by themselves. So I'm satisfied with second normal form. I'm just going to copy these into third normal form and then make the changes in here. So this third normal form says you must remove non-key, or sometimes they are referred to as transitive dependencies. And non-key or transitive dependencies are fields which are dependent upon non-key fields which are dependent upon other non-key fields for their value. Now, if I look through these tables, I guess the only real candidate in this particular example is tutor email being dependent upon tutor ID. So I'm really focusing on the non-key fields and looking for dependencies between other non-key fields and non-key fields, so I can remove them to a new table. So in this case, I'm going to create another table. I'm going to create the tutor table, into which I'm going to take these two fields and I'm going to pop them in there, and I'm only removing a copy of tutor ID to this table so that I can maintain my link. So this now becomes a foreign key, and this becomes my primary key. And again, I'm just making sure that before I leave that normal form, I'm assigning the primary key. So this maintains my link back, if you like, to my unit table, and you'll see then there are links then between each of the tables. The unit ID, the unit student links the student to the unit, and then the tutor table is linked to the unit table through the tutor ID, which is a foreign key in the unit table.